Bruce Hoskins. I manage the soil testing program at the University of Maine. And we're going to talk about high tunnel management, fertility management today. This is kind of a specialty type test that we provide in collaboration with the University of Vermont. Who here is growing in high tunnels, or in any high tunnel? One or two? Okay, we've got a few folks that are growing in high tunnels, have a little experience, hopefully. This is really catching on really in the last 10 years in Maine. It caught on in probably 10 years before that in Vermont. So Vermont has about 10 years more experience in high tunnel growing than we have in Maine. But the whole thing has really snowballed in the last 5 years because USDA now cost shares the construction of a high tunnel. So we have a lot of new growers coming online who really don't have too many clues about what they're in for. Everyone's used to open field production. Growing in a high tunnel is a whole different situation. So this is a fairly typical high tunnel, probably a 30 by 100 tunnel, and this is a winter greens crop. So this tunnel has undoubtedly had high heat summer cropping like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, those things that grow really well in high heat. And at the end of the growing season, they'll take that out and put in some greens that will last into the winter. Sometimes they'll grow a late fall, early winter greens crop, and then let it rest for about a month in the middle of the winter. Once you're out of solar winter, about the middle of February, you can plant a second greens crop for late winter and early spring, and then back into a high heat crop for the summer. So these tunnels are typically being at least double cropped, if not triple cropped every year. So it's pretty intensive. And it's not just double and triple cropping, but it's also the type of yield that you're getting out of these tunnels. This is from an early collaborative project with the University of Vermont where we were doing some early work on nitrogen and potassium response in tomato production. And this is marketable yield per plant. The scale's kind of hard to see. That's kilograms per plant. So it tops out at about 7 kilograms per plant. That's 15 pounds of marketable fruit per plant. There were 600 plants in 3,000 square feet. So that works out to 1.5 tons of fruit, marketable fruit, on every 1,000 square feet of growing area. And if you expand that to a per acre basis, which most of us are used to dealing with, that's 65 tons per acre of marketable fruit. Tremendous yield and tremendous nutrient demand to go along with it. Just calculating nutrient removal from that kind of yield, you have 180 pounds of nitrogen, about 40 pounds of P, not P2O5, but P, and 400 to 500 pounds of potassium. So tremendous yield potential, tremendous nutrient demand, and double and triple cropping on just a few thousand square feet. So obviously it's a whole different ballgame from growing outside, and we're trying to come up with adequate ways of managing fertility in this kind of a high demand environment. So high tunnels, they're kind of a hybrid system. It's not open field production, it's not greenhouse bench crop production. It's in ground, so you're relying on basic soil fertility like you would with outside production, but it's in an enclosed environment with a lot of extra heat gain. So you get a lot faster growth rates, a lot more yield from those extra heat units. And if you are adding manure, compost, or other non-chemical nutrient sources, it's going to speed up the mineralization because of your higher soil temperatures, which may be 10 degrees higher than they are outside, maybe even higher. There's no natural rainfall. You're supplying all the water. So when you step into that tunnel, you're not in Maryland, you're not in Kansas anymore, you're not in Maine anymore. You're in an irrigated desert. That's what you've created in a high tunnel. And so you get some of the benefits of the irrigated desert production and some of the problems of irrigated desert production. Oh, one of the big benefits of having a dry environment is you keep the foliage dry. You're supplying all the water typically with drip irrigation underneath, and tomatoes especially are prone to a lot of foliar diseases, septoria wilt, early blight, late blight. They all require wet foliage to infect the plant. So it really is a lot easier. You get a lot better disease control. But on the other hand, for that extra heat, if you do have an insect outbreak, it's going to make that even worse. So it's a double-edged sword of that extra heat. You are drip irrigating, so it does give you the opportunity to add nutrients through the drip by fertigation. So that's another benefit. Problems, even more so than with the desert, is because it's a closed environment, it gets really hot in there. I've seen 100 degrees Fahrenheit on February 15th in a closed high tunnel, even in Maine. Okay, so it gets really hot in there. You do have to ventilate. Once you get up above about 110, 120 degrees, you're going to start cooking the plant. You're going to have some heat damage. And as I said, if you have an insect problem, it's going to aggravate it. Insects like the extra heat, just like the plants do. And because you get this extra growth rate, higher productivity, higher nutrient demand, what may have been an adequate amount of potassium or nitrogen in outside production all of a sudden becomes a deficiency problem in a high tunnel. So the other thing is you have faster mineralization that I've mentioned before. This adds more nutrients, but you can also have nutrient salt buildup. So in a desert, well, I should preamble it by saying here in outside production, especially east of the Mississippi, total annual rainfall exceeds the amount of water that's lost from a combination of evaporation and transpiration. So evaporation plus transpiration loss from the soil is less than what we're getting in total rainfall for the year. In a desert, it's the other way around. Okay, the amount of water that you're getting from natural precipitation is less than the amount that you're losing through evaporation and transpiration. So you have this net upward movement of water through the soil, through diffusion, and it just evaporates from the surface, and whatever was dissolved in that water is left at the surface. So you have in an irrigated desert, you have this salt buildup issue at the surface. Same thing in a tunnel. If you're growing outside anywhere in the east, you're not used to that kind of a situation, and that's one of the problems that sneaks up on growers, especially new growers, is the salt buildup issue. How bad is it? Well, this is just a one-year-old tunnel. Does everyone know about salt? How soluble salts are measured? Salt level is usually done with a water extraction, and then you measure the electrical conductivity of that extract, of that water extract. And the scale that we commonly use is millimos per centimeter, which are the US units. The international units are decisiemens per meter. If you buy a salt meter, it's going to have one of those two units on. They're numerically identical. And the problem level is up here around 2.5 for new seedlings, something that you're going to seed in like spinach or greens like that. Tomatoes will tolerate a little bit higher, the plants that you've transplanted in, but they're going to run into problems above 3.5 or 4. Okay, so in just 1 year, we've got an accumulation of just below the critical salt level in the top inch. So this is inch by inch. This is the first inch. This is 1 to 2. This is 2 to 3. So we go from 2 down to less than 1, and then down to less than 0.5 by the third inch. So there's quite a bit of stratification here just in 1 year. This is a 4-year-old tunnel. Here we are at 10. Where are you going to seed your spinach or your greens? It's going to be in that top inch. You think they stand a chance in that kind of salt level? No way. So this is from some of the research we've been doing And we're going to use these to encourage growers that before you replant these beds, you need to till that material back in to what's underneath. Number one, to cut down on the salt level, but also to salvage that nutrient content. Because this isn't just sodium that we're talking about. These are the actual nutrients that are in that water extraction. This is sulfate sulfur. This is calcium here in purple, potassium in yellow. Nitrate is the purple dots or brown dots. Here's sodium way down here. Sulfur was over 1,000 parts per million in that top inch. So these are all water-soluble nutrients that were carried up, wick to the surface, and left there when the water evaporated. Tremendous stratification of these nutrients. You just don't see this in outside production. So, how do you adequately monitor and manage nutrients in this kind of a high demand environment, this arid environment that you've created with this salt issue? Well, we've come up with a couple of different testing systems, and basically it's a two-step system. Earlier tunnels work better with one testing system. Tunnels that have been in production for a while work better with another one. They're fundamentally different, and I wanted to give you kind of an image to show you what the fundamental differences are between the two tests and why we're doing what we're doing when we're doing it. So, most nutrients are taken in as water-soluble ions. Plus charge ions, calcium, potassium, magnesium. Minus charge ions like nitrate, phosphate, and sulfate. These are dissolved, these ions are dissolved in the soil water, and this is how nutrients are actually taken into plants. The total available content of these nutrients that is actually dissolved in the soil water, the proportion is very small compared to what's held in reserve. So as the plant takes in these nutrients through the soil water, they're replenished by nutrients held in reserve on exchange sites and in complexes, stable compounds that break down and release as the soil water content decreases from uptake. So here's kind of a nice pictorial representation of how nutrients are held and supplied and taken into plants. So this, you have finely broken down organic matter or humus particles, and finally fine mineral material, clay particles that have these negatively charged surfaces. I think everyone knows about cation exchange sites. These all have negative charge, and so they bind plus charged nutrients, or bond them, or adsorb them is the proper term. And they're held in reserve there. Here we have the soil water between the particles, and we have water being actively taken into an actively growing plant. And so we have three different pathways of intake of nutrients from source to sink, the plant being the sink. So we have diffusion, which is, we have a fertilizer granule here, this is phosphate, and diffusion is just movement of ions from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. And this is fairly slow and gradual. The other second pathway, more significant one, is mass flow. So you have water being taken into the root on bright sunny days to feed that transpiration demand of the top. And nutrient ions that are dissolved in that water are just carried along like a leaf on a stream. The third method is direct interception. So if this root hair grows out and makes contact with this surface of that clay particle, it can take in nutrient ions directly off from an adsorption site. This happens occasionally, but the vast majority of nutrient uptake is through a combination of diffusion and mass flow. So field soil tests, your routine field soil tests that you would get from your university or private lab, is going to use a Malick 3, or they're going to use a Morgan or a modified Morgan. And they're accessing all soil, routine field soil tests access not just what's immediately available, but everything held in reserve. Okay, you want to have that soil's, you want to be measuring that soil's capacity to supply nutrients over the entire growing season or multiple growing seasons. So you're looking at the entire sum total here. So you're treating the soil as a nutrient storehouse. You're looking at nutrient reserves as well as what's immediately available. So you're extracting a quantity of nutrients that correlates well with plant uptake and hopefully with yield. Whether it's Malek 3, whether it's modified Morgan, we're all trying to access that total available nutrient pool. And so you extract with a fairly strong solution that pulls off all of those nutrients held in reserve. You filter it off, and you measure the nutrient content in the extract, and then you back calculate what's in the dry soil and record it as a pounds per acre or parts per million level of available nutrient. The second test is what I would call generally a soil water test. Okay, the nutrient reserves are pretty much ignored. What we're looking at in a soil water test is just what's dissolved, what's immediately available. Go back to that picture. Okay, we're not looking at these in a soil water test. We're just looking at what's out here, just what's immediately available in the soil water. So if you think of the reserve levels as a quantity of available nutrients and what's in the soil water as a nutrient intensity, what's available right now. Okay, that's the fundamental difference between these two tests. Is a soil water test is just looking at what's immediately available. It's more of an intensity measurement. And this is done with a saturated media extract. We add just enough water to the soil to just saturate it. So we take some random volume of soil. In this case, about 150 cc's of soil. We add just enough distilled water to just saturate it. We don't want water standing on the surface, but we want to have all the pore spaces full of water. So this is called the saturation moisture content of the soil. Is how much water will that soil hold just at the saturation point, and that's going to depend on clay content. It's going to depend on organic matter content. So every soil is a little bit different. Okay, so this basically is a true soil water test in that we're saturating the soil depending upon its moisture retention characteristics. This has a constant relationship or a fixed relationship with field capacity. So if you poked holes in the bottom of this beaker and let it drain overnight, about half of that water would drain out. And that's the maximum amount of water that the soil will hold against gravity. Is called field capacity. So saturation is about 2 times field capacity in terms of moisture content. So this type of testing system is used. This is pretty much the standard nationwide method for greenhouse bench crop soil, which is a peat-based, typically a peat moss-based material, holds a lot of water, doesn't have much in the way of nutrient retention capacity, but has a big water holding capacity. So the saturated media extract is the standard method for greenhouse media, and it's also used in irrigated deserts, where you have a high salt buildup at the surface. So this is in situations where the soil's nutrient retention capacity, all of that retention capacity, negative charge, is completely loaded, all stocked up, and you have a lot of what's called free salts, those nutrients that are just dissolved in the soil water. So this is a standard field soil test in Arizona, New Mexico, Central Valley of California. Is a saturated media extract. And since you've created an irrigated desert in a high tunnel, it makes sense to use it there as well. So basically, this is another representation. Here's all of your negatively charged sites on clay and humus particles, and it's fully stocked with nutrients in equilibrium with those nutrient ions in the soil water or soil solution, it's also called. So here we're just managing nutrients at the intensity level out here in the soil water. And as I said, each soil holds a different amount of water. So we don't get the same amount of water out of a field soil. Out of that 150 cc's of soil at saturation, we got about 30 back of water. And here's a greenhouse media sample that's mostly peat moss, will hold actually more than its own weight in water. So from the same 150 cc's of material, you're going to get this much out of a field soil, this much out of a high organic matter greenhouse mix. So, it's a variable dilution rate, basically, in a saturated media extract. So, which test do you use in which situation? Well, for startup tunnels, the first year when you're transitioning from an open field production to a covered system. Okay, so in this case, just a routine field soil test is very appropriate, but you want to build those nutrient levels up to the top. You don't want to go with just barely sufficient levels. You want to build to the top, top of that optimum range, push things up there to kind of prepare the soil for this higher nutrient demand. Just a routine field soil test the first year is very adequate. Once you've been in production for a year, now you need to start to monitor for salt buildup and for nitrate carryover. This is the second thing that sneaks up on people. You notice the nitrate level in that nutrient profile I showed you. What happens to nitrate in open field production over the winter?
Gets leached.
It gets leached out, leached or denitrified. You don't get that in a tunnel. Everything that's there that you put in that wasn't taken in by a crop plant is still there. Okay, so you can, if you're really amending nitrogen like you would in outside production, yes, you have higher productivity, but if you're over amending even by a little bit, you're going to have some buildup because you don't have natural rainfall to carry away the excess at the end of the season or over the winter. So open field nitrogen management just doesn't apply in a tunnel. So, and a higher nutrient demand means you need to load to higher nutrient levels in the soil. So this is basically looks the same as our routine field soil test in Maine. Has pH and organic matter in brown, the major nutrients in green, including nitrate up here, and the micronutrients in blue. And so this, basically we're monitoring all the nutrient levels. We do measure the soluble salt level is down here at the bottom. In this case it was 3.9. That's not graphed out, but it is part of the test. And the other part is to recommend nutrients for this higher nutrient demand. So the nitrate level in outside production, because we're assuming some loss to leaching and denitrification at any time that you're measuring, hopefully during the growing season instead of in the spring or the fall, where nitrate in open field doesn't really mean much. In high tunnel production, we got higher nutrient demand, so instead of going for 30 or 40 parts per million of nitrate, ideal in outside production, we want to see 100 to 200 parts per million. Okay, we had 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre and 65 tons of tomatoes. So that's 200 to 400 pounds of nitrogen that we're shooting for in our recommendation system. With phosphorus, we're roughly doubling the amount of phosphorus, the optimum level, or the ideal level that we would in field production. Potassium, we're shooting for 400 to 600 pounds, ideal soil test level. The highest crop demand in field production in Maine is potatoes. The sufficiency level of potassium in potatoes is 450 pounds per acre. And so we're pushing really up to about 600 pounds per acre for tomatoes in high tunnel systems. And we do want to have a little higher organic matter level. These soils, they dry out very well. They dry out excessively in this high heat environment where you're only applying just enough water to keep things going. We want to enhance moisture retention. So we're pushing ideal organic matter levels instead of our routine 5 to 8%. We want to go from 8 to 12%. Organic matter is ideal, just to try to enhance moisture retention. So after 2 or 3 years, this is what the field soil test looks like. Everything's loaded up. Okay, we have all the entire moisture, nutrient retention capacity of the soil is fully occupied. This is the point at which we need to start managing nutrients at the intensity level in the soil water. So the second test that we run is what we call a long-term high tunnel test. Typically, we're going to hit that saturation point at about 3 years, depending upon how aggressively you've amended your soil. So we're going to run basically just the saturated media extract. We're going to run an organic matter level, and we're going to start managing nutrients at the water soluble level or intensity level rather than the quantity level or total available content from a field soil test. So because it's a soil water test, you're going to have a completely different set of interpretations and a completely separate set of recommendations. And this is what we've developed in conjunction with the University of Vermont over the last 5 years. Originally, these came from some early work done at Michigan State. The saturated media extract was first developed at Michigan State for use on greenhouse bench crops. And as I said, it's become pretty much the standard method nationwide for greenhouse bench soil, peat-like mixes, soilless mixes. But Whitmer and Honma applied this to some early greenhouse in-ground production of tomatoes and cucumbers, and they used a saturated media extract, and these are the levels, the ideal levels that they came up with. These are the current levels that we're using in Maine and Vermont, fairly similar to the original guidelines. The one big difference is phosphorus. Phosphorus stays bound in soils quite tightly. If you're looking at reserve levels of phosphorus, you're going to be looking at very high levels. Water soluble levels are going to be quite a bit lower. So instead of this 8 to 13, we've backed this way down to 1 to 5. We're both pretty well satisfied that if you can see 1 part per million of water soluble phosphorus, that corresponds through cross correlations that we've done to 100 or 200 pounds of phosphorus reserves in the soil. So we've backed way off on the water soluble levels of phosphorus. Potassium is pretty much the same, calcium, magnesium. We bumped up the top end of the total EC level. Really depends on the crop. Tomatoes will tolerate 3.5 to 4 reasonably well because they're a high nutrient demand crop. So it's pretty typical that a high nutrient demand crop will typically tolerate higher salt levels than those that have a lower requirement. You would not want to try to seed greens into EC of 4. You'd want to be down around 2.5. So those are our current guidelines. And this is what we call our long-term high tunnel test. Optimum ranges for pH, total salts, organic matter, major nutrients and micronutrients over here. The level measured in the middle. And then we have a color-coded interpretation on the right-hand side. So anything that's below optimum is going to show up as a blue low. Anything that's in that ideal range is going to show up as green optimum or okay. We do have, for nitrogen and potassium, we do have an intermediate interpretation, a medium interpretation that shows up as, well, halfway between blue and green, which is purple. And then anything that's above optimum is going to show up as a purple high. If it's a dangerous level, it's going to show up as a red flag. So that's our basic long-term high tunnel test using the saturated media extract, but you can still run into problems. Sooner or later, you're going to hit the wall on the EC. In this particular example, we're up over 5, almost 5.5 on the total salt level, and that shows up as a red high. You got a red flag there. You got a problem that you need to deal with, and we'll talk about how to remediate salt levels in just a couple of minutes. So this is we have a whole range of different management scenarios in high tunnels, and we're trying to address both early on growth in high tunnels and later on for well-established tunnels by one of these 2 soil tests. Excuse me. This is the recommendation system that goes along with that saturated media extract test. And almost all of our tunnels are certified organic. And a lot of them are growing at least one crop of tomatoes. So really our whole testing and interpretation system is based around tomato production in organic houses. We do make recommendations in terms of chemical fertilizers if you want, both in the field soil test and in the saturated media test. But these are in terms of non-chemical, OMRI-approved NPK calcium sources. So, and this is from Whitwer and Homa's original work. These have been modified slightly with experience, but basically this is based on water soluble. These are soil water levels that we're testing. And so for every 10 parts per million of nitrogen that you want to increase, these are the amounts of blood meal, soybean meal, or alfalfa meal that you need to add on every 1,000 square feet to raise it by 10 parts per million. So if you want to bring your nitrogen level up by 100 parts per million, you would need about 42 pounds of blood meal on 1,000 square feet. Likewise with potassium, this is for every 20 parts per million increase. Potassium sulfate, if you wanted to go, if you had a really deficient potassium level, which is pretty common in tomato houses, you want to go up 100 parts per million in potassium, water-soluble potassium in the soil water. That would take 5 times 20, or 5.5 pounds of potassium sulfate on every 1,000 square feet. So that's how this recommendation system works for NPK and calcium. So, how do these two tests, are they interchangeable? Do they give you the same answer? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You're accessing two fundamentally different pools of nutrients. One's the immediately available nutrient intensity, the other one is the total quantity of available nutrients as a quantity measurement. So the one time that they definitely agree is if you have a low total quantity in a field soil test, you're obviously going to have a low intensity because there's just not any pool of available nutrients to supply that soil, that immediately available nutrient content. If you have a high quantity in the field soil test, it doesn't necessarily translate into an optimum, a high or even an optimum level in the soil water test. And most commonly that happens with calcium and magnesium. The soil water test does tend to underestimate the sufficient quantities of calcium and magnesium. And typically they're well-lined soils up between 6 and 7, and that you've got there by adding lime, which is going to supply plenty of calcium, but it's not water soluble. So we're still trying to cross-correlate these two tests to some extent. The other difference between these two tests is a field soil test always reports nutrient content in the dry soil. So it's either parts per million or pounds per acre. The saturated media extract is a soil water test, so you're reporting nutrient content as parts per million in the soil water, not in the soil itself. So numerically, you're going to have differences between the two, and so they're not completely interchangeable. So what do you do about problems that show up in the tunnel? So wanted to go over some remediation steps that we've come up with and that we're still developing. High tunnel production, because it's so intensive, so nutrient intensive, so tillage intensive, is not really necessarily all that compatible with good soil health, soil quality practices that are being promoted, but you can minimize the damage with a few practices that I'm going to outline. Salt buildup is your biggest problem. Once you get up above 3.5 or 4 millimos, you're going to start doing damage to roots. Even on salt-tolerant plants like tomatoes, you're going to start doing damage. So the other problem with high salts is loss of aggregate stability. It tends to disperse soil, especially if you have a really high sodium level. In fine textured soils, you really need those good micro aggregates maintain the tillability and the infiltration rate of the soil to water. So there's several different ways you can take care of a salt level, but basically it comes down to you either have to flush the salts out with water or you have to dilute them with something that has a low salt content. So we try to emphasize to our growers, you need to uncover your houses at every few years. And the easiest way is to just uncover, let the rainfall, natural rainfall, carry the salts down through the soil and out the bottom of the root zone. Let Mother Nature do what she does naturally outside. You're going to be switching out the poly. Greenhouse poly is usually guaranteed for 3 years. Most growers are getting about 4 years out of poly. Then you have to take it off and put on new poly. Perfect time to just leave the house uncovered for a month or more, 3 or 4 good rainfalls, and flush out your excess salts. And a lot of our growers do that. But those that are really growing intensively can't afford to take it out even for a month, or at least they don't think they can. So we have a lot of growers with salt issues. And the other option is to apply the water yourself. You can either use overhead irrigation or just flood irrigation. And it's going to take several inches of water to flush out these salts. We had a grower who he just couldn't uncover his house. He was double cropping. He was disabled, so he had a special setup so he couldn't move his house from one year to the next, or even after several years. It was a permanent structure. So he lined the base boards of his greenhouse with plastic, and he called up his friends at the local fire department, and they showed up and emptied 3 tanker loads of water and put 8 inches of water in his entire greenhouse. And that slowly percolated down through, and it dropped his salts from over 10, I think he was almost 12, down to less than 3. But that's the volume of water that it takes, 6 to 8 inches, to flush out all those, a salt level that's that high. Dilution is the other option. A lot of growers, especially in Vermont, have been using peat moss. You're adding organic material, you're adding volume without adding nutrients. Okay. The problem with that is when you open a bale of peat moss, you ever try to get that stuff wet? Right? You can't. And the more peat moss that you add to the soil, the more the soil starts acting like peat moss. And of course it's going to be dry. It's going to get bone dry in there, and then it's a real bear to get it wet again. The same thing can happen with compost. You're adding a lot of extra nutrients with compost that you may or may not need, but compost has the same effect. It's hydrophobic. It repels water when it gets super dry. Once you get it wet again, then it will hold water. The best option is if you can move your house. And this is really best for, for soil quality, is if you can kind of just treat it as another plot in the field and move the house after a year or two to a new location, usually just drag it the length of itself. And there are greenhouses that are built that run on rails. And you can just move them back and forth and kind of rotate, grow your high heat crop in, with the tunnel over it, start your fall and winter greens crop off the end of it. When you're done with the tomato crop, just move it down and re-anchor it. That's the other thing I need to mention is, if you've never dealt with a high tunnels fly. And just about every grower has at least one horror story where they've come home and found their tunnel either, one guy came home from being out of state over Thanksgiving, and he found his 80-foot high tunnel sitting upright in the middle of his driveway because there was a big windstorm that had come up. I've had 2 tunnels moved myself. One was a little hoop house. They picked it up and it moved it 30 feet and set it down right side up. So I got really lucky that time. The second time, not so much. I took a 20 by 20 tunnel and completely flipped it up over backwards. So tunnels need to be very well anchored. So that sometimes it's not compatible with moving them from after a year or 2. Okay, frequent tillage. if you're double and triple cropping, you're going to be tilling that soil a lot. If it's fine textured soil, you're going to start breaking down your soil aggregates, which is going to affect permeability. It's going to affect even the establishment of some of your beneficials. So we have a number of growers who actually will grow cover crops even without moving their house. Here's a winter rye cover crop. If you can afford to take, now this typically is growers that have 2 or 3 tunnels and they can rotate between. If you can take 1 tunnel out for half a growing season, that's all you need for a crop of winter rye. To grow it up here to the boot stage, then you have to mow it down. Hopefully, in this case, you got doors that are big enough that you can get in with a tractor and a flail mower. We've got a number of growers that will grow winter rye in the late fall into the spring for the boot stage. They just wades in with a weed whacker, takes it all down, tills it back in. You can't seed crops after that, but you can transplant into them. Just 1 cover crop every 2 or 3 years will greatly improve soil structure, improve your soil biology, and really has a lot of benefit. And I already talked about adding too much peat moss and compost, making the soil hydrophobic. So the other option of diluting your salts is to add just field soil. Just find some low fertility field soil, add 2 or 3 inches, usually about 1/3 to 1/2 by volume, till that into your high salt bed soil, and basically dilute them out that way. Okay, I wanted to, we got time, yep. Wanted to mention some of the current and ongoing research that we have. We really have developed a nice collaborative group in the Northeast in New England. We have research folks in Maine and at UNH and University of Vermont, and we have a very large and active organic growers organization, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, that obviously is interested in organic production in high tunnels. So they're also collaborating in on this. So this is our high tunnel tomato team, if you will. We were just finishing up a 2-year preliminary experiment where we were looking at primarily potassium response in organic tomato production. We had 3 houses, 2 in Vermont, 2 different locations in New Hampshire, and 1 at the University of Maine Research Farm in Monmouth. And they all got the same fertility treatments. There were 3 completely different soil types: loamy sand, a sandy loam, and a silt loam. We went with a constant rate of nitrogen, 300 pounds per acre, and from 0 to 900 pounds per acre of potassium. So we wanted to kind of cover the whole range of potassium that might possibly give us a response. And this is all organic production, so these are approved, OMRI-approved nutrient sources. Nature Safe is a 13% nitrogen material that's composed of feather meal and beet meal, fairly fast release material. And we use natural potassium sulfate as the potash source. So we're looking for yield and quality response to potassium primarily. And we definitely have gotten some really significant response in the 2nd year. Good yield response, good quality response. We're still analyzing the data, but we've gotten some good preliminary results. And the quality response that we're looking for is yellow shoulder. This is classic potassium deficiency in tomato fruit. This is basically unmarketable. This is a ripe tomato. This isn't partially ripe. This is fully ripe. It just never gets completely red. And this is classic potassium deficiency in tomato fruit. So this is from low potassium treatment to high. I think this wasn't 0, but it was 100 pounds per acre. This is the 900 pounds per acre. So we're looking at really nice inverse relationship between potassium fertility and fruit quality, and we're also getting a yield response from this preliminary work. And next year, we're starting a 3-year SARE grant project, which we're basically taking that preliminary experiment and expanding on it quite a bit. We're going to stick with pretty much the same fertility component, looking at nitrogen and potassium response. We're going to use the same 3 houses, or at least 3 different locations in Maine and Vermont, Maine and New Hampshire, and perhaps Vermont. And what we're trying to do here is to recalibrate our soil testing systems. All of our sufficiency levels for potassium and nitrogen for field production just go out the window in a high tunnel. So basically, we're going back and recalibrating from scratch. Okay, so we want to find that critical test level of potassium, of nitrogen, of phosphorus perhaps, that in our routine field soil tests, modified Morgan, the Malic 3 that you folks use here, and in the saturated media extract. So we're doing basic recalibration of all those tests, and then we're overlaying an IPM component. As I said, sometimes there's some insect issues. Aphids are number 1, followed by whitefly. And okay, this is organic production, so we're going to be looking at biological controls, looking at banker plants where we maintain predator insects that will hopefully take control of the aphid and whitefly population. Banker plants work by you seed the banker plants with an alternate food source, like a peach aphid or something like that, and then you release your predators. That keeps the predators fat and happy, so that when the target organisms on your crop plants show up, you've got an active population of predators that can take them out. And we're going to have a big outreach component. We're going to have 2 different high tunnel workshops, one for beginning growers toward the beginning of the project, and one for established or what we call the advanced high tunnel workshop toward the end. A lot of on-farm demonstrations, and we're hoping to do some YouTube videos and things like that. So that's where we're headed for high tunnel production, and what we've done so far. So I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.